The March of Polish Patriots, organized by the Movement for the Defense of Borders, will set off on Saturday, the 26th of April, from Warsaw's Dmowski roundabout, promptly at 12 a.m. This is a very important event, which will show nationwide opposition to mass migration, which at the moment, the European Union with Germany, with the lack of resistance from the government of Tusk, is being introduced in Poland. The march is intended to show that Polish people do not agree with the government's policies on migration, both on the issue of migrants being sent to us from Germany and on the assumptions of the EU Migration Pact.
Trzeba wyrzucić do kosza pakt migracyjny.
The Migration Pact needs to be thrown in the trash. It needs to be said clearly and explicitly that Poland does not agree with the evil that illegal migration brings. Residents of cities, towns, realize the dangers. But despite the fact that Polish people are mostly against cultural enrichment from imported so-called engineers from Germany, it seems that this does not affect the actions of the Tusk government. He wants to inflict such unpleasantness on ordinary people, most often outside large urban centers, that is, where he has less of an electorate. So you can see that he doesn't care about the security of Poland and the Polish people. He only cares about his own self-interest and makes sure he gets another pat on the back in Western Europe. That's why there are protests all over Poland against illegal migration and the government's building of so-called integration centers for foreigners. The pressure makes sense. In the Podlaskie voivodeship, no centers for the integration of foreigners will be built for the time being. And in the Kujawsko-Pomorskie voivodeship, one of the partners who was supposed to run the Center for Integration of Foreigners withdrew. I would like to add that this took place on the 9th of April. And on the 6th of April, we organized a picket in Toruń against the Center for Integration of Foreigners and against illegal immigration. There is a discussion in all local governments. As Poles cut off from knowledge and information by the mainstream media of the Third Republic of Poland learned that in their immediate vicinity of their homes, mass migrants are to be placed in closed or open centers. There is no consent to this. In local governments dominated by the December 13th coalition, the implementation of the Migration Pact adopted after Donald Tusk came to power is underway. Well, unfortunately, I don't have any good information on short notice because the resolution passed, so more than 2 million will be spent on migrants. The situation is very dangerous. If we see and hear the civic platform politicians in local governments who clearly say, yes, we will accept illegal migrants. That's why the Border Defense Movement has prepared draft resolutions against illegal migration that local governments can adopt. We would like to propose a certain solution that should be implemented throughout Poland to protect against mass immigration. Our experience from, for example, Siedlce, Radom, Częstochowa, and many other cities in Poland says that Polish people do not approve of mass immigration. The big test in terms of migrants being sent to Poland is the upcoming presidential election, which will also be a vote on the Migration Pact being pushed by Brussels.
Pakt migracyjny to jest...
The Migration Pact is the result of the political arrangements of the EU oligarchs and, after all, the civic platform, which Rafał Trzaskowski is vice president of and belongs to this oligarchy. That's why the presidential election is so important. It will show whether Donald Tusk will manage to close the system and continue the EU migration policy.
Despite fully intending to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office, the U.S. administration is disappointed with the attitude of both sides and is beginning to send increasingly worrying messages. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that President Donald Trump may abandon attempts to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine within days if there are no clear signs that such an agreement is possible. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who met in Paris with representatives of France, Germany, the UK, and Ukraine, indicated that President Trump remains committed to reaching an agreement.
We're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about in a matter of days, whether or not this is doable over the next few weeks. If it is, we're in. If it's not, then we have other priorities.
The head of U.S. diplomacy said there are many other important things in the world that also require attention.
The Ukraine war is a terrible thing, but it's not our war. We didn't start it. The United States has been helping Ukraine over the last 3 years, and we want it to end.
According to experts, Rubio's statement is an element of pressure on Russia because it was around the Easter holidays, hypothetically, that the ceasefire was supposed to go into effect. We can treat this as a part of negotiations, growing pressure and growing impatience about Russia's attitude. In the broader plan, nothing has changed. It is China that remains the biggest threat. NATO's doctrinal document also holds China as the #1 threat. In contrast, Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking to Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Rome, has a somewhat softer message and says the United States is optimistic about ending the war.
We have a couple of important issues to discuss today. I want to update the Prime Minister on some of the negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and also some of the things that have happened. Even in the past 24 hours, we think we have some interesting things to report on, of course, in private. So these negotiations, I won't prejudge them, but we do feel optimistic that we can hopefully bring this war, this very brutal war, to a close.
Ukraine and the United States signed a memorandum Thursday as the first step toward a mineral deal. We are happy to announce the signing, with our American partners, of a memorandum of intent, which paves the way for an economic partnership agreement and the establishment of the Investment Fund for the Reconstruction of Ukraine. We hope that the fund will become an effective tool for attracting investments in the reconstruction of our country, modernization of infrastructure, support for business, and the creation of new economic opportunities. President Trump has sought an agreement that would give the United States preferential access to Ukraine's rare earth metals as repayment for Washington's military aid to Ukraine, as well as a form of insurance against Russian attacks. Meanwhile, Russian rockets continue to fall on Ukrainian cities. Civilians, including children, are being killed. The 1,150th day of the war has been a tragedy for the residents of Kharkiv and Sumy. 2 people have been killed and dozens injured. It was 3 Iskanders with cluster munitions that caused the terrible scene we see here. This is a residential area. It was early in the morning when people were waking up and going to school and work. This is how Russia began this Good Friday, with ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, Shaheds, maiming our people and cities. The Russians also struck Sumy on April 13th, Palm Sunday. The attack killed 35 and wounded 117. Footage released by Al Masirah TV on Friday, April 18, showed the charred remains of vehicles and burning fuel tanks after what it said was a U.S. strike on the Ras Isa fuel port in western Yemen. According to U.S. Central Command, on Thursday, April 17, it struck the Ras Isa fuel port in western Yemen to cut off a source of fuel for Iran-backed Houthi militants. Houthi-ran media Al Masirah TV said the strikes killed at least 74 people. The footage shows Red Crescent personnel removing a body bag from the site. Thursday's attack is one of the deadliest since the United States launched airstrikes against the Houthis in its biggest military operation in the Middle East since President Donald Trump took office in January. The next day, on Friday, April 18, thousands gathered in Sana'a to show solidarity with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and protest U.S. strikes on Yemen. The United States has vowed not to halt the large-scale strikes unless the Houthis cease attacks on Red Sea shipping. Health Ministry spokesperson Anis al-Asbahi said 171 people were injured in Thursday's strikes, according to preliminary figures, with rescue teams continuing efforts to search for victims. The U.S. military claims the attacks were aimed to cut off a source of fuel for the Houthi militant group.
A place that attracts believers from virtually every corner of the world, the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, the city of Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. For us believers, it is a special place because it makes us aware of this tragedy of Good Friday, you can say. Because on the one hand, this indifference of people, because there are different businesses and religions here, so some are trading, others are engaged in some business, and in the midst of this crowd, a group passes by, praying and carrying the cross. It was similar in the time of Jesus, who walked, and those closest to him were in pain, the Mother of God, his closest disciples, while others indifferently looked on as just another condemned man. There are an especially large number of pilgrims here this year. Catholic and Orthodox people celebrate Easter at the same time, and the Jewish holiday of Passover is underway, hence the crowds, which the walls of Old Jerusalem have not seen in a very long time. Of course, each of us around the world somewhere internally renews use this in ourselves every year, but to touch directly here these places associated with Christ is such a unique feeling. However, the situation of Christians here is becoming more difficult every year. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is taking away many families' jobs and hope for the future. Most families make a living from tourism, and the streets of Jerusalem or Bethlehem are mostly empty on a daily basis. Christians are also increasingly becoming victims of attacks and persecution from both sides. Let us also try to look positively with this Christian hope at the situation in which we live in and in which local Christians also live, suffering, but also not losing courage, witnessing Christian love, Christian forgiveness, and this hope of peace for all the inhabitants of the Holy Land. Hope is also needed in neighboring Syria, where attacks on Christians there have multiplied in recent months. Easter holidays there are especially difficult now. The threat of Islamic extremists, mixed with extreme poverty and lack of prospects. These are the Christians who today carry this cross of everyday life, the cross of not having enough bread for their children, the cross of not being able to get to a doctor, to buy medicine, and we try, like Simon of Cyrene, to help them carry this cross of everyday life. Helping those most in need every day is what Polish nuns and Polish priests try to do. Despite the bloody conflicts constantly present in many places in the Middle East, every day, following Jesus, they offer their lives to others.